Okay, so this is a continuation of period 8 for Apush, getting into chapter 38 of your American Pageant textbook. We've already been talking about President Nixon's administration and his involvement in the Vietnam War. And we mentioned a little bit of his domestic policy, him being a rhino, facing the OPEC crisis, and doing some things like establishing the EPA and things like that. But now I'm going to get into what everyone really thinks about when they think about Nixon's administration, which is the Watergate scandal. So this actually started back when Nixon was running for re-election in 1972. In the spring of that year, the Democratic National Headquarters, so like the headquarters of the National Party for the Democrats, their offices were broken into, and their offices were located at the Watergate business complex, which you see in the top right there of the slide. And they caught the guys breaking in. They hadn't even taken anything. It was like while they were breaking in, they were caught. And they were arrested and arraigned. And when they were arraigned, one of the guys, James McCord, admitted that he worked for the CIA. So everyone was like, why is the CIA breaking into the DNC? That's super sketchy. And then they found out that he had been a consultant for the Nixon re-election campaign that was underway. So none of the guys really talked at all. They weren't snitching on anyone. And the guy who was running on the Democratic ticket against Nixon in the election, his name was McGovern. He tried to make a big deal out of it, and he was like, everyone, this is corruption. This is they were trying to break into the offices. The Nixon administration organized this, yada, yada, yada. But nobody really bought it. Nixon himself was like, I'm going to cooperate with this investigation. I want to get to the bottom of this. We can't have any type of scandal like this going on. And he seemed like he was like really far away from this. He very famously said, I'm not a crook. So the American people bought it. And he overwhelmingly, I mean, you saw the re-election map. We can take another peek at that down there at the bottom there. He won every state except for Massachusetts and DC. So people weren't really buying what McGovern had to say. And Nixon got, re-inaugurated in January of 1973. But in 1973, it came time for the trial of the guys who had broken into the offices. It really looked like they were going to go to jail. And I guess at that point, James McCord realized, like, oh, I'm not going to actual jail. That's not going to happen. I'm going to start talking before that goes down. So he started talking and saying that he was just like basically like following orders, and that things had come up from much higher than him, and that the White House administration was implicated in this. So the Senate decides they need to do a full investigation of this situation and get to the bottom of this. Who in the White House is responsible here, and how high up does this go? How far up does this go? So they begin investigating and having all these hearings and bringing people in, and just like every day it seemed like another person in the White House had been discovered to be in on, if not in on the break-in, at least in on trying to cover up the break-in. So finally it looks like maybe President Nixon is involved. Now, while all this is happening, two reporters for the Washington Post, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, had been also investigating this, and they'd been getting tips from an anonymous source who they were calling Deep Throat in all the papers. And so if you're wondering, if you're snickering about the Deep Throat thing, they actually named his code name after the porno that had just come out, thinking that everyone would want to read the paper if they were thinking that that's what it was about. That's what it was about, but that's not what it was about. So this anonymous source, it was a deep source, meaning that even the editor didn't know who the real person was. Only Woodward and Bernstein knew. He had been telling them that Nixon had been involved, and not necessarily in the break-in, but in the cover-up. And that they needed to follow the money, and that they could easily find out like how high up this went. So the Nixon administration is scrambling. They are trying to find out who Deep Throat is. So they put together a special group in the FBI to discover who it is. Turns out the guy leading the group was Deep Throat. So he didn't really do much of an investigation. But Woodward and Bernstein and their source information that they were getting here, they were able to keep all this constantly in the public eye, really stirring up a lot of drama. So as the Senate is investigating, they find out that Nixon has recorded every conversation to take place in the Oval Office. So the Senate is like, okay, great. Turn us over those tapes of those recordings. We can listen to them. And if you've talked about any of this, then we know you're guilty. And if you haven't, then we can just move on. And Nixon's like, no, absolutely not. These tapes fall under executive privilege. This is the Oval Office. Things said in here are, highly classified. I can't just hand that stuff over. So the Senate actually sues Nixon for the tapes in the case U.S. v. Nixon. So we've got the legislative branch suing the executive branch, and it's going to be the judicial branch that has to figure out the answer here. So a very weird strain all of this is putting on the branches of our government. Ultimately, the Supreme Court decided in the case that Nixon needed to turn over the tapes and that they did not fall under executive privilege. So he turns over the tapes and they begin listening to them, and there are massive chunks of time missing. They'll just be talking on the tapes, and then all of a sudden it will go silent for like an hour and a half, and then it'll pick back up again. And they're like, what's going on? Why are we missing all of this information? And Nixon's like, oh, my secretary must have accidentally deleted some stuff when she was preparing the tapes to give to you. And at that point, the Senate was like, nope, you are obstructing justice. You're tampering with evidence. This is crossing the line. Like, you're heavy in this cover up at this point. So, the Senate gets ready to impeach Nixon. They decide they're gonna charge him with obstruction of justice and conspiracy, essentially. So he decides, instead of letting them impeach him, that he's gonna resign. So he resigns, and his vice president needs to take over. Now, when Nixon ran for re-election in 1972, his vice president that was elected with him was a guy named Spiro Agnew. But Spiro Agnew had resigned actually a few months prior because he had got caught up in a separate corruption scandal because he got caught taking bribes when he was the governor of Maryland. So when he resigned, President Nixon appointed a new vice president, and his name was Gerald Ford. So Gerald Ford became president when Nixon resigned. He hadn't been elected president. He hadn't even been elected vice president. He's the only president we've ever had who gained that office with not one vote cast for him, which is very odd. Now, as soon as Ford took the oath of office, he decided he was going to pardon President Nixon, saying that he wanted to sort of put all of this behind him. But really, everyone just thought, like, collusion. The two of them planned it. Like, he might have been in on it too. It just made Nixon look sort of even more guilty. So we've got really the presidency now sort of shrouded in corruption and scandal. Not good after Johnson's presidency, which hadn't gone well, or Kennedy's presidency that had ended in his assassination, and we don't even know who did it. President Gerald Ford, one of the shortest presidencies we've ever had, only president for 2 years. He wasn't able to really accomplish much in those 2 years. There were a few things he tried to do. One thing he tried to do was he tried to attack that stagflation issue we were experiencing with a program called Whip Inflation Now, WIN. And unfortunately for Ford, win was a lose, and it ended up being a total disaster. This initiative actually caused businesses to shut down, so he actually caused the unemployment rate to increase. So that was obviously not what he had intended. And then as far as foreign relations goes, there were two things that Ford had done trying to repair our relationship with the Soviet Union. One, he organized and signed the Helsinki Accords, which was a human rights agreement among many different nations in the world. And then also the SALT II, which the SALT, S-A-L-T, is the Strategic Arms Limitation Initiative. So basically, he's trying to end the arms race with the Soviet Union. We're both agreeing to limit the amount of nuclear weapons and missiles that we're producing. So those are all steps in the right direction, but there was just no shot really of Ford to win election in 1974 because 1976, because he had just, everything was just, everyone was so done with his party because he was associated with the Nixon administration, and it was just really a bad look. So when he ran for election in 1976, he was beaten by the Democratic candidate, which was Jimmy Carter. So Jimmy Carter is definitely one of the most interesting presidents we've ever when he ran for election in 1976, he had his only, governmental experience had been serving as the governor of Georgia for one term. So he had been in politics for 4 years, and before that, he had been a peanut farmer. So not exactly a lot of experience here, but that's what people liked. They thought he's a fresh face. We're going to have someone who's not in all this corruption and scandal that Nixon had been in and that Johnson had been in and that had killed President Kennedy. So people really felt good about that. In addition to that, we're seeing a big rise in Christianity in the late 1970s and into the 1980s, which I'll talk more about later. But Jimmy Carter was a born-again Christian. A lot of people like that too. They wanted to bring back morals and virtues to the White House. So when he ran, he was elected in 1976. So a few things that Jimmy Carter did. At home, he really tried to attack that those economic problems that we were having, but nothing had really been successful. He did appoint a new head of the Federal Reserve named Paul Volcker, who did put in, I'm not saying Walker like the Fast and the Furious, Volcker, Volcker. He did raise interest rates in the United States, which stabilized things for a little bit, but those were left in place for too long, which then caused more problems down the line. But really, when we think of Jimmy Carter's presidency, a lot of what people remember him for was actually his foreign policy. Jimmy Carter, I gotta say, was just a man that was too nice to be president of the United States. His foreign policy idea, or his ideology, was that the United States should only work with or cooperate with countries that respected human rights and respected the rights of their people and treated their people well. That is a very nice philosophy, but it's not very realistic when you're, the president of the largest and most powerful nation in the world. We've got to eventually, work with people who might not necessarily be always good people, but if it's for the betterment of us or the world long term, or if it's better for our interest, then that's what we a lot of times end up needing to do. But Jimmy Carter didn't want to do that. So he actually is going to set back a lot of our relationship with the Soviet Union, because we know that the Soviet Union, it does not fall under the category of countries that respect human rights. So he actually withdrew from the SALT II, so we're back in the arms race. He also decided that we were going to basically cut off any positive diplomatic relationships with them until they changed the way that they were running their country in terms of treatment of citizens. And this pissed off the Soviet Union, withdrawing from the SALT II and basically like throwing them out the window. So the Soviet Union, actually, in an effort to spread communism in the Middle East, invaded Afghanistan. We were looking for any way to prevent that from happening, because we don't want we don't want communism to spread. So we found a group in Afghanistan that had been trying to resist the Soviet invasion, called the Mujahideen. So instead of sending American troops into Afghanistan to support them, we just sent money and weapons to the Mujahideen to help them resist Soviet invasion. Turns out, down the line, the Mujahideen will be the Taliban. So we're actually arming the Taliban under the Carter administration. We just didn't know that that's what we were doing. But also, in 1980, the Summer Olympics were supposed to take place in Moscow. So Jimmy Carter decided that we were going to boycott the Summer Olympics because we didn't want to go to Moscow. And that really pissed off a lot of people. If you know anything about athletics or the Olympics, these athletes work their whole lives, and they have a very limited number of years in which they can actually compete when they're at their physical peak. And so not participating in these Summer Olympics, there not being another Summer Olympics until 1984, really set back. It took a lot of athletes out of the running, and that really angered a lot of people. Jimmy Carter also turned over the Panama Canal back to the citizens of Panama. Over the years that we had constructed and maintained the Panama Canal, we spent over, between $8 and $10 billion on the Panama Canal, and Jimmy Carter just gave it back to the people of Panama for free. Today, the Panama Canal makes about $12 million a day. None of that money belongs to the United States. Jimmy Carter also pardoned all of the Vietnam War draft dodgers. Republicans at the time called this the most disgraceful thing a president had ever done. These are, men who had been drafted who refused to report for duty. But what about all the men who had reported for duty or lost their lives in Vietnam? They don't get to, we can't bring them back. And we're just saying that the ones who didn't, it was okay that they didn't. So a lot of people were very angry with Jimmy Carter about that as well. Now, during his presidency, he, like I said, he was really trying to this advocate for world peace and working with nations in a positive way. So one beef that he tried to solve, one effort at world peace was the Camp David Accords. Camp David is a presidential vacation home in I don't know, New Hampshire, Connecticut or something. And Jimmy Carter invited the president of Egypt and the prime minister of Israel to come to Camp David and sign a peace agreement. Now, if you don't know much about the relationship between Egypt and Israel, this is a biblical beef. This goes back to before Moses. The Egyptians held the Hebrews, which are the Israelis, the Israelites, held them as slaves for thousands of years, and they were not freed from their bondage until Moses, we know, led them out of Egypt. And so the relationship between Israel and Egypt has never been a good one. But Jimmy Carter decided that he could be the one to end that, beef that's older than Jesus Christ himself. So he invited them to come to America. They signed this agreement, the Camp David Accords, in which Egypt would recognize Israel as an independent country. They would be the first Muslim nation to do so. And then in turn, Israel would respect the land and property rights of Egypt. So the Israeli prime minister goes back and announces this agreement, and his people are so excited. They throw him a parade. This is amazing, world peace. The president of Egypt goes back and tells his people, and they are so angry that he is assassinated. And when the new person is put in place, he throws out the Camp David Accords. And so Jimmy Carter basically got this man arrested. If you're looking at this photo down here at the bottom, you can see how proud Jimmy Carter was of this moment. But this is the Israeli prime minister here, and this is the president of Egypt here, the one who was killed. Now, lastly, getting involved in the Middle East here, we're starting to see some conflict about what's going on now. During the OPEC crisis in the earlier 70s, we did not like the leader of Iran because he had taken those oil reserves and put them back under control of Iran, and we weren't able to use them, which, we already said caused our gas prices to go up 400%. So the United States basically, orchestrated a coup of that guy and put a new guy in place called the Shah, S-H-A-H. And the Shah was a lot better to us because he was allowing us to buy and use the Iranian oil reserves, but he was not good to the Iranian people. He was not someone that they liked. He was very selfish. He lived really in the lap of luxury while the Iranian people were living in poverty and famine. He was very progressive Muslim, which a lot of the more conservative population of Iran was not here for. There was a lot of women not wearing their hijabs and a lot of Western influence in Iran, and a lot of people really resented that. Now, the Shah had committed war crimes, executing civilians and things like that. So the Iranian people, a revolution was brewing. They wanted to overthrow him, try him with war crimes, and execute him. But he got cancer. And Jimmy Carter decided to let him flee to the United States for cancer treatment, and that we would basically protect him here. And that really, really angered the Iranian people. They were like, no, he needs to, we want justice. He needs to stand for his crimes. And Jimmy Carter refused to turn him over. So a bunch of rebel students in the capital city of Tehran, which is Tehran, ended up storming the American embassy and taking 66 Americans hostage in Iran. That's the picture in the top right part of the slide. They were held hostage for almost 2 years, about a year and a half. They were beaten, tortured mentally and physically, and Jimmy Carter would not turn over the Shah because he was like, I'm not going to negotiate with terrorists. My dad actually was in the army at the time and signed up for a special ops mission to try to extract some of these people from Iran, but Jimmy Carter would not approve the mission. He didn't want to send anyone in because he thought that might make matters worse. So by the time Jimmy Carter was running for re-election in 1980, all these things had really been sort of the nail in his coffin. People were very unhappy with his leadership. And Ronald Reagan, who was running on the Republican ticket in 1980, his big thing was, I'm gonna bring the hostages home. And he, we'll talk more about his election in the next period, but when he was running for the campaign, he was already negotiating with Iranian officials to. So Reagan won the election in November of 1980. He was already, he had made this plan already, and so about a week before he actually swore the oath of office, the Iranians agreed to release the hostages, and that's really going to set the tone for the rest of Reagan's presidency moving forward. It was definitely more one of like strength and sort of restoring the United States as this, like powerful entity, when a lot of people had felt like Jimmy Carter and his administration had made us seem sort of like weak and easily sort of taken advantage of or pushed over. So like I said, I think Jimmy Carter, nice dude, just not a nice president.